There are other kinds of plagues that visit us, and whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad with power. In today's unpacking of Cate Blanchette's Tar, we'll ask not the spiritual question, what do you do when no one is looking? But the version more relevant to the powerful. What do you do when you can get away with it? When they can't quit? When because I'm the boss is enough? If you have a lot of turnover or rumblings of small mutinies, if you're worried about recruiting the best and harder keeping them, as is always the case, it's your fault. And it was Lydia's as well. Why? Well, let's get into it. As a conductor, Lydia Tarr had achieved an enviable career that few could even dream of. She was seen as a genius in the field of classical music. She had won an Oscar, a Tony, and a Grammy.
Cate Blanchette Tarr.
She was the first female conductor at the famed Berlin Philharmonic. But, isn't there always a but? She had a fatal flaw, an unspeakable, unchecked flaw. She groomed young artists who were desperate to get recognized and offered them promotions or opportunities in exchange for adult favors. And she got away with it for a while, until her actions literally destroyed a young woman's life. And since karma never misses, as Tarr continued in her ways, she ended up orchestrating her own downfall.
Lydia, you're confused.
It's my scar! You fucking little nothing!
And in the end, lost everything. Tar is about the corrupting nature of power and its consequences. Though, as is usually the case, a few layers deeper, we find the practical. Famously, as you may have already heard, throughout the movie, Lydia Tarr admittedly defended the concept of separating the art from the artist. Convenient for her, considering her off-duty sins. In one scene, she had a heated argument with a student about how we shouldn't judge Bach's work based on his questionable past. His gender, irrelevant. His whiteness, equally irrelevant. To quote Tarr, if you want to dance the mask, you must service the composer. You have to sublimate yourself, your ego, and yes, your identity. You must, in fact, stand in front of the public and God and obliterate yourself. A less poetic translation is, great art is identity agnostic. It is a priori great. And as such, if you're defining your art or anyone else's art based on their traditional social identifiers, even if you have virtuous intent, you too are the problem. Lydia tells a student in explaining this idea, don't be so eager to be offended. The narcissism of small differences leads to the most boring of conformity. This is the classic artist versus their art debate. The pioneer versus his racism, Christopher Columbus. The revolutionary versus his adultery, Martin Luther King. The philanthropist versus his exploitations, J.D. Rockefeller. Apple and Nike using near slave labor, how Qatar built their stadiums. And yet, have you boycotted your iPhone? Have you stopped wearing Jordans? Did you not watch the World Cup? The big question, therefore, in this movie, no matter how powerful you are, how much prestige you have, especially when it's based upon a legitimate skill and you've earned that place, when you really are the best at that vocation, can you break the fundamental principles of right and wrong and still get away with it? Or better, should you be able to get away with it? The short answer, and the thesis, I would argue, of this movie is no, you cannot break the laws of principled right and wrong, even if you're a master. Because if you do, those decisions will at best come back to haunt you personally in those small, intimate moments that you have with yourself, turning mute and depressing any corporal advantages you may incur as a consequence of your sins. But at worst, they may literally destroy your business. By any means necessary requires then a qualifier. Yes, wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, live off of rice and beans, and work for free so that you can learn, sure. Do 100 calls instead of 50. Give up your weekends. Never watch Netflix. Instead, take notes on the top books. Great. Do by any means necessary to get your goal, whatever that is. But there are guardrails, namely ethically reasonable. And what's worse, the more power that you have, the more likely people will forgive you for cutting ethical corners. The temptation's greater, the better you are. Many people, the classic example, thought Steve Jobs was mean, but they didn't care. He changed the world. Who cares if he's mean? Who cares if he's incredibly mean? Who cares if he's a shitty father? And that's kind of a good question, but only because there is a difference. Being mean doesn't cross a line of the universe. However, what Lydia Tarr did, she did cross a line. What she did is unforgivable. And let's be honest, being a good conductor, as much as the liberal arts community would counter, does not change the world. So naturally, it came back to haunt her. Think of the trolley car experiment in philosophy class, the one where you have to choose if one person dies or 50 people die. If you're in a runaway trolley careening towards a track, towards your goals, you're going to have to make some tough decisions along the way. Should I choose the 1 or the 50? Even if it's as minor as disappointing your parents or your spouse or your business partner, the 1 in the short term in favor of winning the larger 50-person goal, you're gonna have to make some trades. But in any case, you need to walk that fine line between aggression and ambition. You can be intense, harsh, and forceful. You can move away from your family when they think that you should stay. You can fire the employee who wants another chance. You can hire a lawyer to protect your intellectual property. You can negotiate hard for that raise. Sometimes you must be intense, but you cannot sacrifice your morals to reach those goals. That much is for sure. The universe is watching, and remember, it's always keeping score. But that begs the question, why is Tar important as a movie artistically? Tar is an aggressively anti-blockbuster popcorn movie, and it's unapologetic about it. To start off, the opening credits present the film crew first. And it's important to note that these credits are usually shown at the end of the movie and rarely watched. They're just skimmed through. But Tar forces you to watch the credits before the movie even starts. And this goes on for as long as normal credits go on, before the movie starts. So you're already a bit antsy and potentially even bored before the movie begins. But then worse, the respite, the first scene of the movie, it just digs in even further into this is a work of art statement. In the opening scene, Lydia Tarr is being interviewed in a theater from some New Yorker type regarding her opinions about classical music. And the interviewer is not asking, why is classical music important questions? He's asking, why is this one composer's interpretation of the third part of this specific violin solo important? And this goes on for about 15 minutes. And during this interview, Lydia mentions around 10 important classical music names that I have not a clue who they are. And I consider myself fairly well educated, but I literally didn't know anyone she was talking about, which makes sense. People who are trying to pay for their groceries or pay their payroll don't care about the third part of that one violin solo at the end of the Berlin 30 years ago. But Lydia does. She does care, which sets up the rest of the movie exquisitely. Immediately, you understand her grandeur and her specificity. She's being interviewed in a full theater. You don't understand what the hell she's talking about, but she understands what she's talking about. She's beautifully articulate, composed, and powerful. Keyword powerful. It's an ornately well-crafted and long and detailed exposition dump, but a necessary one. The mastery she has over her specialization is the setup. When you are one of one in a world of money, that money will often be very forgiving of your trespasses if it wants what only you can give it. By the way, the opening will absolutely put off many viewers who will get bored from watching the opening scene, and the director is aware of this, but he doesn't care. From the very beginning, they're telling you that this movie is different. They're saying this is a piece of art, a cerebral piece of art, and you are just going to stick with us because it's Cate Blanchett, by the way, and basically everything she does is gold, and you know it, and that's why we hired her. And there's going to be some intellectual work that's going to be necessary on your part to get the movie. But in the end, if you hold on, it's going to be worth it. And yes, it's therefore not for everyone. But yes, it was worth it. It was never going to be a mainstream success unless Cate Blanchett won Best Actress, which she didn't. But that's because it's made for the more erudite class and people who value art, and this type of work, it just takes a bit too much for them to understand it. It's not for the regular Joe who likes chicken and thinks oysters are disgusting. It's for someone who appreciates Mozart and has, maybe read the Odyssey. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. Handcrafted is different than big box. A personal lesson is not watching a YouTube tutorial. Posters.com is not the Louvre. James Patterson is not Toni Morrison. They're all fine, by the way. But what I appreciate about Tar is that it is unapologetically itself. It knows who it is. It knows its audience. And it's not going to dumb itself down for mass market appeal and more ticket sales. Which, by the way, this is an artistic lesson and a business lesson. As an artist, you're always making the decision of what you're trying to say and to whom and how. The same goes for business. You might choose to sell handmade, intricate tables with beautiful designs that take you months to create each one, and you can make a living at this. But you're not going to sell more tables than IKEA, and you therefore shouldn't be mad if you don't sell more tables than IKEA. IKEA is going to beat you, even if their designs are just okay and their tables will fall apart in 2 years. If the metric is revenue, you're going to lose to IKEA. Same goes for Tar. It's probably a 10x more meaningful piece of art than the next Spider-Man, but it won't touch the next Spider-Man in terms of revenue. Point being, don't be delusional. Be aware of the total addressable market of your company and of your genre of art. And no, it's not everyone else's fault because they don't understand me. It all comes down to self-awareness and product market fit. There's no right way to go about art or even business as long as you're being conscious of and are aware of the consequences, therefore, of your decisions. Which brings me to my next few points. Tar has within it basically 4 major business lessons to teach you. So let's get into them. Lesson 1, exceptional success requires exceptional focus. Lydia Tar has a separate house for deep work. Not a room, not a desk in a basement or in her garage, but an entire separate apartment with a separate piano because she's unwilling to allow for the possibility of distractions while she's in deep work. Same one for J.K. Rowling, by the way, Harry Potter. After her 4th book came out, J.K. Rowling was getting recognized too often in public, so she could no longer work at the cafe where she wrote the first few books, and it wasn't easy, therefore, for her to get into her deep work flow at home. And for a while, she couldn't figure out a solution. But jokingly, she said, because she forgot that she was now rich. So inevitably, she ended up writing in a penthouse in a hotel. And after she wrote the final words, she scrawled a message on the back of a bust of Hermes in the room saying, J.K. Rowling finished writing Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows in this room. Obviously, the lesson here is not to rent a room in a Scottish hotel or have a separate apartment in Berlin where you can get away, but to have the mindset that you will do whatever it takes to go into deep work. Unless you do that, you'll never be able to get into true flow. And then therefore, you'll never be able to reach mastery. And honestly, you can't allow yourself to have any stupid excuses. Turn off the phone if necessary. Unplug the internet if you have to. Wake up before everyone else wakes up. Lock the door. Tell everyone they are not allowed to bother you. Go to a cafe and play really loud music on your headphones. Whatever it takes. If you want to reach mastery, you must necessarily practice over and over and over and over again, which means you have to aggressively say no to everything else and everyone else. Lesson 2, you can't achieve mastery by copying others. I learned this in the film. Composers apparently use red and blue markers on their musical sheets to highlight how they'll emphasize, interpret, and perform any particular piece of music. So it makes sense that other composers or students would want to study Lydia's notes. But when a rival/friend conductor, Elliot, asked her to show him her notes so that he could study them, she said, trust me, you do not want to go to school on someone else's red and blue pen. There's no glory for a robot. Do your own thing. Now, by the way, this does not mean there's not efficiency in reading books or copying the masters when you're coming up. Skipping steps or learning from other people's mistakes is a good thing and efficient. I often read journals from great novelists to study their mindsets while writing masterworks. Steinbeck's A Journal of a Novel or Journal of the Grapes of Wrath, these were highly informative for me as a young writer. And that's good and smart. You should study the masters. She's not saying you shouldn't study the masters of your genre or your industry. Lydia Tarr studied her predecessors too. And this is an important point. Once you're a professional, once you're a pro, which Elliot, the other conductor in this case, is, then at some point you have to find your own voice. At some point you have to make your own interpretation. You have to have your own style, your own rules, your own framework, your own intellectual property, your own patent, your own management style, your own idea, your own product or service. And it has to be yours. And it has to be obviously and articulately different than everyone else's, your competitors. The lesson here for the artists and the business owners alike then is that you must eventually create something that is uniquely yours. Yes, you can learn from the masters and you should, but if you want to reach true mastery and impact the world, you have to go into the unknown and do something that really hasn't been done before. You have to earn your own signature, if you will. Lesson 3, mastery is achieved after the grind. Throughout the movie, we see flashbacks of the backstory of Lydia Tarr, tidbits on how she became the first female principal director of the Berlin Philharmonic, basically a monster in a field usually dominated by men. We learn how Lydia spent years researching the music of a local hunter-gatherer tribes and spent time getting her PhD and her master's degree. And decades after that, she grinded through thousands of hours of hard, deep work to get to that level of mastery. But those are just that. They're flashbacks. What we mostly see throughout the film is now she's being interviewed in a theater. We see her multi-million-dollar flat in Berlin. We see her drivers. We see the fine wine on the table at lunch. We see tailors measuring her custom-fit clothing. We hear the clapping when she walks in the room, the silence before she begins, the eyes of the other masters waiting for her signal, and the literal cacophony of sound when then she, and only she, decides to begin. She says in the movie, "You cannot start without me."
You cannot start without me.
In many traditional ways, she's a badass. But that itself is not the lesson. The how is the lesson. Similarly, you might see someone successful on social media and think, wow, they're so young and they've achieved all of this. But the backstory is often 20 years of grinding. The backstory is 4 a.m. The backstory is not going out. The backstory is tens of thousands of hours of practice. The backstory is an insane level of grind and sacrifice. This part is not sexy, and it's therefore not shown, and it's therefore also often overlooked. So you have to be aware that often it's not sexy to show the behind the scenes. It's not easily monetized to honestly and thoroughly articulate the how-to. Gary Vee says, show your work, and that's fine, but eventually, to really scale, you need to be objectively good. And these details, especially in storytelling, are better written as quick tidbits and then passed over. And then she studied for 10 years, paragraph in a biography. It's the irony of me writing literally millions of words and giving thousands of speeches before uploading my first YouTube video about not being afraid to get started. It's the travel vlogger not uploading for 3 months and then coming back saying, sorry, I took some time off for myself. It's the flashy, fast cuts of an Instagram story. It's the training montage before the final fight. And that's fine, it happens, but it's not fully the truth. Another example in front of our faces is Cate Blanchette's performance itself. We're lost in her as Lydia, even though we've seen her in dozens of other movies, not because of some gift from God, but because she trained as a conductor and a musician preparing for this movie. She ran the lines thousands of times and memorized them and practiced them in hotel rooms when no one else was watching. She was nominated for an Academy Award for the end product because she crushed it when the lights were on. But the end product was necessarily predicated upon the professionalism of her preparation. It takes a long time to make something difficult look easy, to play poorly well. And so then you must be mindful of this reality. Be patient, be disciplined. The reward may come, but honestly, it might take 10 years of practice first, 20 years of practice. It takes a while. And unless you're up for the boringness of such a challenge, don't expect a lottery ticket of luck to just come and save you. It's very rare. Lesson 4, hiring and promoting should be extremely objective. The fourth lesson from Tar is regarding recognizing talent and hiring and promoting appropriately. The movie is basically a masterclass for how not to hire and set a hierarchy in your company. Lydia Tar's first chair violinist is her lover. She granted solos and assigned roles to young, beautiful women she found attractive. And even with her assistant, she hired another beautiful young woman who was interested in being a conductor herself and coveted Lydia's position. So rather than hiring someone who could fulfill the more simple role of being an actual, assistant, she hired someone who wanted her job, which gave Lydia more leverage than a paycheck. There, of course, were justifications based on talent and merit. She wasn't a complete idiot, and she still had to create a world-class product for the audience, so her choices were decently competent. It wasn't completely sexualized nepotism through and through. But when there was a tie, and this is the key, the tiebreaker often end up being personal, nefarious, unethical distinguishing factors like youth, beauty, or vague personal preferences, which is an amalgamation of essentially everything you shouldn't do when you're hiring someone or promoting someone. Bringing your employees into your private life, unwarranted nepotism, and assigning people to the wrong positions regardless of their potential conflict of interest is a bias. Basically, using your position of power to leverage what other people want against them and for your personal desire, playing with them. That's not how you build a team or how you build a business that lasts. If you have the privilege and the power to promote people, then the path to promotion must be objective in whatever ways possible. If it isn't, it's not just not ideal, it's potentially devastating, especially now that the marketplace is more transparent than ever. We have access to websites like Glassdoor and public rating systems. One bad PR story or scandal in your company can destroy your company. But even worse, promoting the wrong person for the wrong reasons will definitely hurt your ability to be better and more cost-effective and give more value to your clients or your customers. Which means that if you're hiring and promoting based on personal preferences, you're choosing yourself over your employees and your customers. It sounds simple, hire based on merit, but human nature and our predilections for self-interest, especially when in power, are sometimes difficult to overcome. Nonetheless, we must overcome them because these exact types of difficult decisions are the ones that matter most. They define us. What does this all mean? What's the larger point? In storytelling and in life, only difficult decisions reveal someone's true character. This is taught in 101 creative writing classes because it is necessarily more difficult to make the right decision when one, temptation is high, and two, you're in a position to get away with it. For example, it's a lot easier to not cheat on your wife if you're a small town guy and works in a factory in Indiana. It's much harder for Brad Pitt because if you're that small town guy, you don't really have that many options or lots of temptation. But if you're Brad Pitt and you don't cheat on your wife, that's morality. The point is that it's easy to say, I would never do that, or I would never do this. But how can we ever really know unless we're put in a position to make that decision without having the consequences of that decision? Power corrupts, as they say, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. So don't be so sure you're above it all. The revolutionary often becomes the next dictator. The anarchist club often devolves into a self-policing, semi-fascist state of corruption. The idealist lawyer finds the loopholes. The copywriter tells a little white lie. The business hides its refund policy in the fine print. The stranger is fired quickly. The brother gets the promotion instead. Lydia says it this way: it's not until I conducted that I became convinced that we're all capable of murder. Therefore, as long as you have a goal that will or does require leadership and decision making, you need to be in advance aware of these biases that you may have, that we all have, and you need to plan for them in advance. It doesn't matter if your goal is to be the manager of your local Starbucks or a CEO with 10,000 employees. You must play the thought experiment out to the end and in the real world. Ask yourself, what will I do in these types of situations when I have the ability to cut corners and get away with it? And worse, when people will praise me anyways. That's when you're really tested. The moral of Tar then is that you may not realize that what goes around comes around, and the consequences of these micro sins may not show themselves in the first year or 2 or 5 years, or it may take a decade or 20 years, but eventually what goes around comes around. You cannot trick the universe. You can't trick God. In summary, at the beginning of this movie, Tar is at the top of the world, objectively the best in her field. But by the end, due to her moral lapses, she finds herself in Southeast Asia, conducting a youth orchestra, playing some cosplay/movie soundtrack. She still has the skill, she's still world class, but in her case, ironically, her sins as an artist were not separated from her art. By any means necessary requires she finally discovered its moral nuance. Self-awareness, therefore, as is often the case, is the key. Be on purpose about your decisions and judge them based on ethics, not necessarily quick results. Do not allow the God complex to take over. Do not overstep. Do not cut corners. Do things the right way, over and over and over again. And in the end, it may take a few years longer or a decade longer than if you would have cheated. But if you do things the right way, over time, at scale, leveraging exponentiality in time, you will eventually get what you deserve, as we all do. Hope that helped. Thanks for listening. Until next time.